At my 65th birthday dinner, my husband raised his glass and said, "She is no longer part of this family." For a moment, the entire table went silent. My sister-in-law leaned back in her chair, lifted her wine glass with a slow, satisfied smile, and said just one word. "Finally." I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I simply looked at the waiter, folded my napkin beside my untouched plate, and said calmly, "Then the bill is yours." Then I stood up, picked up my purse, and walked out of the restaurant, leaving them there with the $3,200 check. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and let me know the city you're watching from. I've learned that stories like this travel farther than we ever expect. Because what happened that night didn't start at that table. Not even close. The restaurant was one of those places that tried very hard to look effortless. Soft golden lighting. Dark wood panels. White tablecloths so crisp they almost looked starched into place. The kind of place where a single steak costs more than most people's weekly grocery bill. My husband, Daniel, had insisted we celebrate there. 65 only happens once, he'd said earlier that week, his voice oddly cheerful. At the time, I thought it was sweet. Looking back now, I realize something else entirely. But that evening, when I walked through the glass doors, I didn't suspect anything. I was just a woman turning 65, hoping for a quiet dinner with her family. I had even worn the cream-colored dress Daniel used to say made me look elegant. The one he'd bought me for our 35th anniversary. It still fit. Mostly. When I caught my reflection in the restaurant window before going in, I saw a woman with silver hair softly curled at the shoulders, pearl earrings catching the light. Older, yes. But still standing. Inside, the hostess led me to a long table near the back of the dining room. Daniel was already there. So was his sister, Margaret. Margaret never smiled at me the way other people do. Her smiles always looked like they belonged to someone who had already decided she didn't like you but was willing to tolerate your existence for the sake of appearances. My son, Caleb, sat beside her, scrolling through his phone. My daughter-in-law, Emily, gave me a quick hug when I arrived, though. It felt more like a polite formality than affection. "Happy birthday," she said. Everyone else echoed the words. "Happy birthday. Happy birthday. Happy birthday." It sounded rehearsed somehow. Still, I told myself not to read too much into it. Families go through quiet phases sometimes. The waiter arrived almost immediately with a bottle of wine Daniel had already ordered. A very expensive bottle, judging by the way he nodded approvingly when the label was shown. Glasses were filled. Menus were barely opened before Daniel began ordering. Steaks. Seafood. 2 bottles of wine. Margaret added a lobster tail for the table, laughing lightly. The orders kept coming. At one point, I remember thinking the meal felt unusually extravagant, even for a birthday dinner. But Daniel waved it off. "Tonight is special," he said. I believed him. I really did. Dinner itself passed in strange little fragments. Caleb talked about work. Emily mentioned a vacation they were planning. Margaret told a long story about a neighbor she disliked. But Daniel barely spoke to me. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He didn't ask about the book I'd been reading. He didn't even look at me much. At first, I thought he was just distracted. By the time the second bottle of wine arrived, I realized something else was happening. Every now and then, Margaret would glance at Daniel. And Daniel would glance back. Quick looks. Small nods. Like two people sharing a joke that hadn't been told out loud. It made something cold settle quietly in my stomach. Then, just as the plates were being cleared and the candles from the birthday dessert were set down in front of me, Daniel pushed his chair back. He stood slowly, lifting his wine glass. The restaurant noise softened around us. Margaret leaned forward with obvious anticipation. And Daniel smiled. Not warmly. Not kindly. Just, confidently. Then he raised his glass and said the words that ended 40 years of marriage. She is no longer part of this family. The candles on the small birthday cake flickered in front of me, their light reflecting softly against the polished silverware. For a moment after Daniel spoke, no one moved. No one corrected him. No one laughed like it was a bad joke. The silence at that table told me everything. Margaret was the first to break it. She leaned back in her chair, swirling the wine in her glass with slow amusement. The corner of her mouth lifted in that familiar little smirk I had seen too many times over the years. Finally, she said again, louder this time, raising her glass slightly. Caleb shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He looked down at the table, rubbing the back of his neck like he always did when he didn't want to be part of something. Emily avoided my eyes completely. She suddenly seemed very interested in adjusting her napkin. And Daniel? Daniel just stood there, holding his glass, watching me like he was waiting for a scene. For 40 years, he had known exactly how I reacted to things. I suppose he expected tears. Maybe anger. Maybe one of those emotional arguments couples have when everything finally breaks. But something strange happens when you reach 65. You stop wasting energy on moments that are already finished. I looked around the table slowly. At my husband of 4 decades. At the sister who had never once tried to hide her dislike of me. At the son who couldn't even look at his own mother. And in that moment, something inside me went very still. Not broken. Just quiet. I reached for my napkin and folded it carefully beside my plate. The steak in front of me was untouched. The candles on the cake were still burning. All that celebration. All that theater. And suddenly it was very clear what the evening had been about. This was never a birthday dinner. This was a performance. Daniel wanted an audience. Margaret wanted confirmation. And the rest of them had simply agreed to sit there and watch. The waiter appeared beside the table at exactly the wrong moment, holding a leather folder with the bill tucked neatly inside. He hesitated when he sensed the tension. "Whenever you're ready," he said politely. Daniel didn't reach for it. Neither did Margaret. They were still looking at me. Waiting. That's when I spoke. My voice surprised even me. It was calm. Almost gentle. "Well," I said, glancing briefly at the folder in the waiter's hand, "if I'm no longer part of the family." I paused and met Daniel's eyes. "Then the bill is yours." I pushed my chair back slowly and stood up. No one stopped me. And that told me everything I needed to know. The restaurant doors closed softly behind me. As I stepped out into the cool evening air. For a moment, I just stood there on the sidewalk. Inside, through the tall glass windows, I could still see the table. Daniel was talking to the waiter now, his hands moving in sharp little gestures. Margaret was leaning toward him, clearly saying something with that tight, irritated expression she always wore when things didn't go exactly the way she expected. I didn't stay long enough to see the rest. I simply turned and started walking. The parking lot lights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the sound of traffic hummed quietly from the street beyond. Somewhere inside the restaurant, someone laughed. Plates clinked. Life continued as if nothing unusual had happened. But for me, something had shifted. 40 years of marriage had just ended between one glass of wine and a birthday candle. When I reached my car, I paused with my hand on the door handle. Only then did the full weight of the evening begin to settle in. The strange tension when I arrived. Margaret's knowing smiles. The way Daniel had ordered bottle after bottle of wine without even glancing at the price. And the speech. That little performance he'd clearly rehearsed. Suddenly the pieces began sliding together in my mind. This dinner had never been about celebrating my birthday. It had been planned. Carefully. Deliberately. Daniel hadn't just decided to humiliate me in public. He had prepared the stage, invited the audience, and waited for the perfect moment to deliver his line. And Margaret. Margaret had known all along. As I sat in the driver's seat and closed the car door, I realized something else too. That speech Daniel made? It wasn't just cruel. It was meant to push me out quietly. To make me walk away without asking questions. Without looking too closely at what he was planning next. But Daniel had forgotten something important about the woman he had been married to for 40 years. I might walk away from a table. But I don't walk away from the truth. I sat there in the quiet of my car for a long time, the dashboard clock glowing softly in the dark. 9:47 p.m. 65 years old. And somehow, I was driving home alone on my own birthday. But the longer I sat there, the clearer things became. Because the truth is, that dinner wasn't the first time something had felt wrong. Not even close. When you live with someone for 40 years, you learn their rhythms. The way they move through the house. The way their voice changes when something is bothering them. The small habits that make a life feel familiar. And Daniel's habits had started changing months ago. At first, it was little things. He began staying late at the office more often. Not once or twice a week, but almost every night. When he came home, he went straight to the shower without much conversation. Some evenings he barely touched the dinner I had prepared. I asked him once if everything was all right at work. He shrugged. Just busy, he said. Then came the phone calls. Daniel used to leave his phone on the kitchen counter all the time. But suddenly it was always in his pocket. Even at home. Even during dinner. Sometimes it would buzz and he would step into the hallway to answer. Once or twice I heard Margaret's voice on the other end. That part didn't surprise me much. Margaret had always had a way of inserting herself into Daniel's decisions. Ever since we were young, she liked to remind me that her brother deserved better. Better house, better lifestyle, better wife. For years, Daniel ignored her. At least, I thought he did. But over the past year something between them had changed. They spoke more often. Met for lunch sometimes. Whispered conversations would stop the moment I walked into the room. At the time, I told myself it was nothing. Families go through strange seasons. People grow distant for a while and then things settle again. But sitting in that car outside the restaurant, replaying the evening in my mind, I realized something uncomfortable. Daniel hadn't been drifting away from me. He had been moving towards something else. And Margaret? Margaret hadn't just been watching. She had been helping him. I didn't start the car right away. Instead, I sat there in the quiet parking lot, thinking about Margaret. Because if there was one person who had never approved of my place in Daniel's life, it was her. From the very beginning, she had made that clear. I still remember the first Thanksgiving after Daniel and I got married. I had spent 2 full days preparing dinner. Turkey, homemade rolls, cranberry sauce from scratch, the kind of meal my own mother used to make. Margaret arrived late, looked around the table, and said with a thin little smile, "Well, I guess this will do." Daniel laughed it off at the time. Told me later that Margaret had always been a little blunt. I believed him. For years, I tried. I invited her for holidays. Remembered her birthday. Bought gifts she never seemed to like. I even helped her once when she was going through a rough patch after a breakup, letting her stay with us for nearly 3 months. She never thanked me. Not once. Instead, Margaret had a habit of speaking about me as if I were temporary. Like a guest who had somehow stayed too long. Sometimes she would say things like, "My brother always had such big plans for his life." Or, "He could have done so much more." The message was always the same. Daniel deserved someone different. And over the years, those little comments slowly became something else. Less subtle. More confident. Especially recently. A few weeks before my birthday dinner, I overheard Margaret and Daniel talking in the kitchen while they thought I was upstairs. Margaret's voice was low, but I still caught the words. "You've waited long enough," she said. Daniel didn't answer right away. Then he said quietly, "I know." At the time, I told myself they were talking about business. Or retirement plans. Or any number of ordinary things siblings discuss. But sitting there in the car that night, replaying that conversation in my mind, I realized something I hadn't wanted to see before. Margaret hadn't just disliked me. She had been waiting. Waiting for the moment Daniel would finally decide I didn't belong anymore. I finally started the car and drove home. The house was quiet when I walked in. Too quiet. Daniel hadn't come back yet. For 40 years, that house had been our routine. The same hallway light left on at night. The same creak in the second stair. The same kitchen table where we drank coffee every morning before work. But that night it felt different. Like I had already moved out, even though my coat was still hanging on the rack by the door. I set my purse down and walked slowly into the kitchen. Out of habit, I reached for the kettle. Then I stopped halfway. There was no reason to make tea. My birthday cake was probably still sitting in that restaurant. Blown out candles. Melted frosting. 40 years of marriage ending between dessert plates and wine glasses. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table. And that's when another memory came back to me. 3 weeks earlier. Daniel had been in his home office with the door half closed. I had walked past and heard his voice through the gap. He was on the phone. At first I thought it was a work call. His tone had that same polite, careful rhythm he used with clients. But then I heard something strange. He was talking about the house. "Our place," he said. "Yes, it's in great condition." There was a pause. Then he added quietly, "No, she doesn't know yet." I stopped walking. Just for a second. I didn't knock on the door. I didn't interrupt. I simply continued down the hallway like I hadn't heard anything. At the time, I told myself it had to be a misunderstanding. Maybe he was discussing refinancing. Maybe it was something to do with taxes. But sitting there alone in the kitchen that night, the sentence replayed itself in my mind. "No, she doesn't know yet." And suddenly it felt a lot less like a misunderstanding. It felt like a plan. A plan that had started long before that dinner. A plan Daniel thought I would never notice. What he didn't realize was something very simple. When you've lived with someone for 40 years, you learn how to recognize the moment they start hiding things. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time that night. The house was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming in the background. A small, steady sound that somehow made everything feel even emptier. For years, I had been the one who filled this house with life. Dinner every evening at 6. Laundry folded and stacked on the couch. Birthday cards sent weeks in advance so no one ever felt forgotten. All the small things that hold a family together. And now Daniel had stood in a restaurant and said I wasn't part of that family anymore. The strange thing was, the more I thought about it, the less surprised I felt. Not because it didn't hurt. It did. But because something inside me had already begun noticing the cracks long before that dinner. Especially over the last few months. Daniel had started dressing differently. New shirts. A different cologne. The kind that smelled sharp and expensive. I remember asking him about it one morning while we were making coffee. "New fragrance?" I said lightly. He didn't even look up. "Client gift," he replied. Short answer. Conversation closed. Then there were the weekends. For years, Saturday mornings had been ours. Grocery shopping together. Coffee afterward at the little cafe 2 blocks away. But suddenly Daniel had meetings. Always vague. Always somewhere else. One Saturday, I watched him through the front window as he got into his car. He checked his reflection in the rearview mirror before driving away. Not something a 68-year-old man usually does before a business meeting. At least not one who had been married as long as we had. At the time, I pushed the thought away. You don't spend 40 years building a life with someone just to assume the worst because of a new cologne or a few late nights. You trust the history you've shared. But that night, sitting alone in the kitchen with the memory of his words still echoing in my head, the truth started arranging itself piece by piece. The late nights. The phone calls. Margaret's sudden interest in his decisions. And that quiet sentence I had overheard weeks earlier. She doesn't know yet. I leaned back in my chair and looked around the kitchen we had remodeled together 10 years ago. Daniel might have believed I didn't know what was happening. But after 40 years of marriage, I knew something else too. Men don't usually end a marriage in a restaurant unless they already have somewhere else to go. Daniel didn't come home that night until almost midnight. I heard his car pull into the driveway while I was still sitting in the kitchen. The headlights swept briefly across the living room wall before the engine shut off. For a moment, I wondered if he would come in angry. Or embarrassed. Or maybe ready to explain what had happened at the restaurant. But when the front door finally opened, Daniel walked in as if nothing unusual had happened. He hung his jacket on the same hook by the door. Placed his keys in the same bowl on the console table. Routine. Normal. Like the last 4 decades had taught him. He stepped into the kitchen and stopped when he saw me sitting there. "You're still up," he said. "Not are you okay? Not we need to talk. Just a quiet observation." I looked at him for a moment. 40 years is a long time to know someone's face. Long enough to notice the small changes most people miss. The tightness around his mouth. The way he avoided my eyes. And something else. Relief. Daniel looked relieved. Like the hardest part of something was finally over. I folded my hands together on the table. "So," I said calmly, "how was the rest of the dinner?" He exhaled through his nose, almost like a small laugh. "Margaret said you overreacted," he replied. Overreacted. That word sat in the air between us. He opened the refrigerator, grabbed a bottle of water, and leaned against the counter. "We were trying to handle things respectfully," he added. "You walking out like that just made it awkward." Respectfully. I repeated the word quietly in my head. A public announcement in a crowded restaurant. His sister toasting finally. And somehow I was the one who had made things awkward. I watched him take a drink of water. Then I asked the question that had been forming in my mind since I left the restaurant. "Who is she?" The room went very still. Daniel froze for half a second before lowering the bottle. That tiny pause told me everything I needed to know. Because people only hesitate like that when the truth has already been waiting to come out. Daniel didn't answer right away. He stood there with the bottle of water in his hand, staring at the kitchen counter like the answer might be written somewhere on the granite. That silence lasted maybe 3 seconds. But after 40 years of marriage, 3 seconds can feel very long. Finally, he sighed. "You already know," he said. It wasn't a denial. It wasn't even an attempt to pretend otherwise. Just a tired little admission. I nodded slowly. "Yes," I said. "I think I do." The strange thing was, I didn't feel shocked anymore. That feeling had already passed somewhere between the restaurant and the quiet drive home. What I felt instead was clarity. "So how long?" I asked. Daniel shrugged slightly, like the number didn't matter very much. "A while." A while. For decades of marriage reduced to 2 casual words. He finally looked at me then, as if trying to measure how angry I was going to be. But I wasn't yelling. I wasn't crying. And that seemed to confuse him. "She understands me," he continued. "Things with us haven't been good for a long time." That sentence sounded familiar. Not because it was true. But because it's the sentence people use when they're trying to make betrayal sound reasonable. I leaned back slightly in my chair. "And Margaret approves," I said. Daniel didn't respond. He didn't need to. Margaret's little toast in the restaurant had already answered that question. Who is she? I asked again. This time he said the name. Laura. The name meant nothing to me. Not a neighbor. Not a family friend. Just someone who had quietly stepped into a life I thought was still mine. She works with me, Daniel added. In marketing. Of course she did. That explained the late nights. The new cologne. The sudden interest in looking younger. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then Daniel straightened slightly and said something that told me exactly how far this situation had already gone. She'll probably be moving into the house soon. The words landed quietly in the kitchen. No drama. No hesitation. Just a statement. Like he was talking about replacing old furniture. And in that moment, something inside me finally clicked into place. Because Daniel clearly believed that dinner had ended the conversation. That I would pack my things. Leave quietly. And let him move on with the life he had already started building. What he didn't understand yet was that the conversation had only just begun. Daniel watched me carefully after he said that. She'll probably be moving into the house soon. He must have expected an argument. Maybe tears. Maybe accusations about the affair, or Margaret, or the way he had chosen to end 40 years of marriage in the middle of a crowded restaurant. But none of that happened. Instead, I simply nodded. Not because I agreed with him. But because something else had already started forming in my mind. Soon, I repeated quietly. Daniel seemed relieved by my calm reaction. He pushed away from the counter and took another drink of water. I didn't want things to get ugly, he said. That's why we tried to handle it tonight. In a clear way. Clear. That was the word he chose. As if announcing to a restaurant full of strangers that his wife was no longer part of the family had been some kind of polite conversation. I stood up from the table slowly. For a moment, Daniel stiffened, probably expecting me to finally explode. But I didn't. Instead, I walked past him toward the hallway. Where are you going? He asked. To bed, I replied. He looked confused. That's it, he said. You're just going to pretend none of this happened? I paused at the doorway and turned back toward him. No, I said calmly. I'm not pretending anything. Then I added something that seemed to puzzle him even more. I'm just not in a hurry. Daniel frowned slightly. In a hurry for what? I held his gaze for a moment before answering. For tomorrow. Then I walked down the hallway and into the bedroom we had shared for most of our adult lives. The room looked exactly the same as it had that morning. Daniel's side of the closet still full. His watch still sitting on the nightstand. 40 years of shared life arranged neatly in drawers and shelves. But as I sat on the edge of the bed, another memory came back to me. 22 years earlier. Back when Daniel's construction company had nearly gone bankrupt after a terrible investment deal. The banks had refused to extend his loans. Creditors had been calling every day. And the only reason that business survived was because someone else had stepped in and signed the paperwork. Someone whose financial record the bank trusted. Someone whose name ended up on nearly every important document that followed. Mine. I leaned back against the headboard and looked around the quiet bedroom. Daniel believed tonight had been the end of something. But the truth was much simpler. He had just started a conversation he didn't fully understand yet. And tomorrow, Daniel was going to learn exactly whose house he had been living in all these years. The next morning, I woke up before Daniel. For most of our marriage, that had always been my routine. I would get up first, start the coffee, open the kitchen curtains, and let the morning light spill across the table. Some habits stay with you, even after everything changes. But that morning felt different. Not sad. Not even angry. Just clear. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down at the kitchen table again, the same place where we had talked the night before. The quiet house felt almost peaceful in the early morning light. About 30 minutes later, I heard Daniel's footsteps in the hallway. He walked into the kitchen wearing the same expression he usually had on weekday mornings, tired but focused, like his mind was already moving through the day ahead. For a moment, he looked surprised to see me sitting there. "Morning," he said cautiously. "Morning," I replied. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat across from me. The silence between us stretched for a few seconds. Then he cleared his throat. "Look," he said, "about last night. I know it wasn't easy to hear." I didn't answer. He leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. "But it's probably better this way," he continued. "Dragging things out would only make it harder for both of us." "Harder for both of us?" I nodded slowly, letting the words hang in the air. "I suppose you're right," I said. Daniel seemed relieved by that. "Good," he replied. "Because Laura will probably start moving some things in next week. It would be easier if you had your arrangements figured out before then." Before then. There it was again, that quiet assumption that everything had already been decided. That I would simply pack my belongings and disappear from the life we had built together. I took a slow sip of my coffee. "Daniel," I said calmly, "can I ask you something?" He shrugged. "Sure. Do you remember what happened 22 years ago? When the company almost collapsed?" His brow furrowed slightly. "What does that have to do with anything? Just answer the question." Daniel sighed. "Yes, I remember. The banks refused to refinance your loans," I continued. "Your credit rating was destroyed after that contractor lawsuit." He shifted in his chair. "Yeah, it was a rough year." "And do you remember what the bank told you?" He looked irritated now. "No, I don't remember every conversation from 20 years ago." So I reminded him. "They said they would only approve the financing if someone else signed the documents. Someone with stronger financial history." Daniel didn't say anything. "You were desperate," I continued quietly. "You needed someone the bank trusted." I set my coffee cup down on the table. "That someone was me." Daniel's expression changed slightly. Still defensive. But now, uncertain. I leaned back in my chair and looked at him calmly. "Every major asset connected to that company was placed under my name at the time," I said. "The house. The operating accounts. The property leases." Daniel stared at me. "You remember that paperwork you signed back then?" I added. He didn't answer. Because suddenly, the conversation from the night before wasn't the one that mattered anymore. This one was. And for the first time since the restaurant dinner, Daniel looked like he was starting to understand something. Something he should have remembered long ago. This wasn't just his house. And it definitely wasn't just his life to rearrange. Daniel didn't say anything for a long moment. He just sat there staring at the table, his expression slowly shifting from irritation, to confusion, and finally to something much closer to realization. "You're exaggerating," he said at last, though his voice sounded less certain now. I shook my head gently. "No," I replied. "I'm remembering." I stood up from the table and walked to the small desk in the corner of the living room. Inside the top drawer was a folder I hadn't touched in years. Not because it wasn't important. But because for most of our marriage, I had trusted that it would never need to be. I brought the folder back to the kitchen and placed it on the table in front of him. Inside were copies of the original documents from 22 years ago. The bank agreements. The refinancing contracts. The ownership records tied to the company and the house. All of them carried the same name. Mine. Daniel flipped through the pages slowly. The confidence he had worn the night before was gone now. "Wait, this doesn't mean, it means exactly what it says," I said calmly. "The house. The business property. The accounts connected to the company. All legally tied to my name after that crisis years ago." Daniel leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. "But, we're married," he said weakly. Yes, I answered. We were. The room fell quiet again. For the first time since the restaurant dinner, Daniel looked uncertain about the future he had been so confident about only 12 hours earlier. What happens now? He asked. I closed the folder and slid it gently across the table. That depends, I said. He looked up. On what? On how quickly Laura finds somewhere else to live. Daniel blinked. Because in that moment, the reality had finally settled in. The house he planned to move her into wasn't his to offer. I picked up my coffee cup and took one last sip before heading toward the door. Where are you going? He asked quietly. I paused, grabbing my coat from the rack. For a walk, I said. The morning sunlight had begun filling the street outside, soft and bright in that quiet way early mornings sometimes are. As I stepped out onto the porch, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger. Not even sadness. Just peace. Daniel had raised his glass at my birthday dinner and told everyone I was no longer part of the family. And maybe he was right. Because sometimes the hardest truth to accept isn't losing a place in someone else's life. Sometimes the truth is realizing you built the whole foundation they were standing on. And when you finally step away, everything they thought belonged to them suddenly looks very different.